to share screen. Oops, does it continue? Share screen. I go to there. I go to there. And we go to here, and we go to there. All right. Now, today we're not talking about any particular organism or any particular process that an organism goes through, but rather about a big sort of lumpy concept called an island. Now, an island can be viewed as a habitat, just like a swamp is a habitat, or a cliff is a habitat, or a stream is a habitat. An island can be viewed as a habitat. You could scale it up and call it a whole ecosystem if you wanted to, but people usually don't. Usually they use ecosystem for a bigger lump that would have in it streams and swamps and ponds and hills and cliffs and old forest and young forest and many different kinds of habitats in the same one ecosystem. So dry forest is an ecosystem, or a rainforest can be an ecosystem. Habitats are usually somewhat more particulate, like an island, which you can think of, I'm sure, from a classical standpoint of what an island is, but there are more kinds of islands. They're also a phenomenon. In other words, they occur, they can disappear, they can dissolve, they can come back again. They are a phenomenon that's very dynamic. They do have many definitions in people's minds, whether you view a pond or a stream or a lake as an island, or you a physical island in the ocean as an island. And forming an island is a process that takes place. It's just like birth or death or decomposition. It's a process. So it's it's funny, it's a word that we all kind of know, but at the same time, many people have different viewpoints about it. They can form from absolutely nothing, just start out with no presence there at all, or they can be made out of something which is there already. So to look at that a little more, this is a map that you have seen before, back when we were talking about the big meteor hitting off the tip of Nicaragua, which is this bullseye that you see up here. That's the big meteor that hit the earth and created all kinds of devastation to biodiversity and physical things. But at that time, North America was one great big island. We call it a continent, if you like. I mean, obviously a continent, it's just a very big island. And South America was a different continent, or a very big island, and there was this big water gap in between the two. Now out in here in the Pacific, a plate, a big flat plate of rock and all the basic geological material that makes up a plate under the ocean, slid through this gap out into the Caribbean. And these yellow spots were high points on that cliff. I mean, on that plate, I'm sorry. And they were formed by the plate buckling. So if you can see my hands, if it's something too flat, and put together, pushes together like that, push up, and it makes a ridge. And they were formed by that kind of uplifting from the base of the plate 100 million years ago. So they were high points and they were above the sea. So they were islands. So if you'd looked at this 100 million years ago, you would have said, oh, here's a bunch of islands out here in the Pacific. They slid through into here. And all the time that they were formed out here and then sliding through out into here, they were never connected to land. In other words, they started under the ocean, emerged above the water, and became a distinct island at that time. So that's one kind of island, an island that comes from nowhere. There was nothing there beforehand, and so everything that's on it was colonized. Everything that's there has gotten there by colonization or by evolution in situ, evolution on the island itself. Now, right over here on the tip of South America is a little peninsula that you see sticking out. That peninsula used to stick out further, and it became Trinidad, and it was a peninsula for a long time. And then due to sea level rise, water cut off the base of the peninsula, leaving the island out here. So that island did not start with nothing. That started with a fauna, flora, a biodiversity that was part of the whole South America. So now you cut this by putting water through there, leaving the island by itself. And now what's there is the combination of things that arrive, just like things will arrive at these islands, but also the initial things that were on this big chunk here in the first place. So this island, like Trinidad, has three sources of the things that are there. There's evolution in place, there's things that arrived by immigration, and there's the things that were there in the first place that could never have gotten to the island on their own. Okay? So there's sort of two classes of islands. One is one that arrives de novo, and the other is one that you take a big chunk of something and you separate it, and you then get with it the things, the flora and fauna that were on it. Now, another characteristic of islands is that they come in all sizes. These are islands off the coast of Puerto Rico. And as you can see in this photograph, there's little tiny ones like this right down here, slightly bigger here, slightly bigger. And they get bigger up here. This might be 100 hectares or 150, 200 hectares, something like that in here. And there's the various sizes going off in this archipelago that you see in a line of islands running that way. The point being that these different sizes are all part of the biology or the phenomenon of being an island. Because the bigger you are, the easier it is to hit by an immigration first. So if you're immigrating, somehow you're floating, you're flying, whatever it is, the bigger you are, the more likely you are to get hit by some insect, some bird, some plant, a seed, whatever it is. So size matters that way. Size also matters because it's space in which species can organize themselves. So if you have a very large island, you have very big territory that a different species or population can occupy. And if it's the smaller the island, of course, the more crowded these species get, the more intense their interaction with each other can be. So in a very general sort of way, the bigger the island, the more you think, the more things that can be coexisting on that island. The third thing that's a variable is the age of the island. And that is one that doesn't relate to size so much. In other words, there can be a very old island who is very small. There can be a very young island who is very large, or vice versa. So that variable is a little careful because there's a temptation to think of big islands as older, but that's not necessarily true at all. The second variable that's not really related to their size is how far they are from a mainland. So if the mainland is back out of here, out of sight where the airplane is, how far it is, this island here and these islands may be closer to the mainland than this one is. So they're more within range of dispersing propagules from the mainland. In other words, the distance to the island can be also a variable that can influence what is on it. And finally, the age of the island, meaning how long has it been sitting there to be a target for things that are immigrating, and also how long has it been sitting there for a place in which independent evolution can take place to create other things that don't occur on the mainland source area, or they were on the source area, they got to the island, and they changed dramatically on the island. So there's a lot of different variables involved in what's on an island, or as we say, island biology, which was very fashionable about 30 years ago. Today, it's not talked about very much. Now, let's go look at a small island. Okay, this is a class like you all, except it was a much smaller class than you are. And we arrived at this island. The photograph encompasses the entire island. The island is no bigger than what you see here from one side to the other side. This is right off the coast of Puerto Rico. And from the viewpoint of this island, Puerto Rico is the mainland. Now, of course, Puerto Rico is an island to Central America as the mainland. All right. So here we are, here's Puerto Rico in the background. So you can see how far Puerto Rico is from this little island. And this is the entire class out here. And their job was to find out how many species are actually on this island at this time. We used to visit these islands each year in a field course. And so the first year you go and you find that there's 12 species on the island. The second time you go and you find there's 9 species on the island. So the first variable was, did the number of species go up or down in the year? The second thing was, are they the same species? Has there been turnover or not? In other words, has some species gone extinct from a hurricane, from flooding, from sea level rise, from a disease, from another species arriving with which it's incompatible, and so it got eaten? All these different kinds of variables influence not only how many species are on the island, but which species are on the island. And in this particular case, there was one lizard, not one population, not one species. There was one individual lizard. And it happened to be a male, if I recall correctly. So therefore, it had no choice or no chance of creating an actual breeding population on that island. So the length of time that species would be there, if no other one arrived, is the duration of the lifespan of that lizard. And you say, well, the lizards can live for 20 years, so maybe that would be there for 20 years. Well, yeah, but how often do hurricanes come along? How often does a lizard predaceous gull land on that island and suddenly notice this juicy chunk of food and goes after it and catches it as a predator? So there are various ways that this lizard would not necessarily survive. Now, if it was a female lizard and had been impregnated already, so she could arrive herself, be a population of 1, have a bunch of kids, and start an actual population on that island. But then the other variables kick in. Can a hurricane come and wash the whole island out? If I recall correctly, there were 3 species of plants on the island, and I'm going to remove some of the so I can see better I'm going to try to remove some of these. No, I guess I can't do it with this pointer like this. Okay, just give me a second here. I'm gonna fiddle this and see if I can get no, I can't make it happen. Okay, I can't see myself. I can't see what's on the right-hand side of the photograph over here, but I think there was another species of grass growing out over here on the right behind the images that are showing. And so then this was one down here, and there was one there. Now, the question also becomes, are these a breeding population? In other words, you left this thing to go for 100 years, and there was no hurricane, no big traumatic event that took place. Would these species still be there? Are they reproducing? Very commonly, they're not. Very commonly, this for example, this could have been one vegetative piece of a plant or one seed of a plant, which starts out and grows and germinates and makes a big sprawling, vegetatively producing plant, and eventually it's gone. So that dynamic is a very important part of the variables in island biology when you start talking about how many species are there, and of course immediately the question becomes up, well, what's the duration of time of these species there? How long has the island been there? And how do they get there? Well, here I'm in a canoe out in the output of a big river in Africa, and the river is flowing under this bridge that you see here in the background. You see the three panels there, that's a highway going across there. And there's a big freshwater river flowing from the interior of, in this case, Nigeria, out into the ocean. And I think it was Nigeria, and I'm afraid I have to look at the slide label to remember which river it was. But the point is, it's a big freshwater thing coming out, and right in the middle of it is this. And I very stupidly did not at the time think to take a close-up picture of this little, if you like, raft. This was just seething with insects. In other words, it's a little life raft, and as it goes out to sea, so now we just turn around, and this is a different individual one going out to sea. So this is the ocean out here. These 2 little rafts were just seething with insects. They could easily have had a frog on them. They could have had a turtle on them. They could have had a lizard on them. Probably not a mouse, but that could be possible depending on how big and solid they were. But the point being that this is how a lot of species get to islands, species that can't fly or fly very poorly, but they're rafted. Because what happens was that this raft was upriver, breaking vegetation, breaking away from the river bank or from a shallow area on the side of the river. And as it floated down the river, insects that had fallen in the river climb out on it as a life raft. But then they're on the life raft, they're on their way out to sea. Now, obviously, the grass bulk of these will end up out there being drowned and eaten by fish or decomposed by marine organisms, and that's the end of it. But some of them are going to hit one of those targets called an island. Now, here's an example. In this particular case, the river is right over here on the left side. This is in Costa Rica again. The river's on the left side, and the junk coming down the river is flowing out into the ocean. But when it gets into the ocean, some of it gets turned right around and washed right back up on the beach. So this log that you see right here is as though it had landed on an island, except in this case, it got kicked back to home and ended up on the mainland, so nothing happens. But this is an example because if you take a look at this branch, see there's a single branch sticking out of that log right there. And if we go look closely, more closely at that single branch, which is right there, right behind it is webbing of a spider between this piece of the broken off tree and the branch right here. That web with the spider on it right there is exactly the kind of thing that would take that spider to an island. So it would arrive on the island and it'd go on being a spider. But now we begin to ask this other question: was it already impregnated? Did it have enough to make, so it could make a whole population of spiders? We'll see these later on. Whole population of spiders on the island. And then, of course, what happens if we think of spiders as pretty fragile? What happens if a hurricane hits that island later on and literally drowns the spider out? Well, the next time you come around with your class a year later, the island may be covered with spiders, but it's a different species of spider. Not because it was competitively ousted by the incoming one, but rather the one that was resident was clobbered by some physical event, and then the new one just had a free ocean, a free place to start a whole new population. But this is the point. This is how these animals get to who can't fly, can't swim, how they get to islands. Okay. Now, the second thing is this is Puerto Rico, and this is the Puerto Rican snake. It's a species that is believed by the snake people as being, as they say, endemic to Puerto Rico. Now, it occurs on about, I don't know, 40 islands, so 40 little islands in the Caribbean. And so it's thought of, it doesn't occur on the mainland. It's not on Central America or Florida or any place like that. And so the biologist's tendency is to say it's endemic to those islands, that little set of islands. Well, that brings immediately several questions. Who was its ancestor and where did it come from? In other words, if it's only on the islands, was it a mainland species that rafted, and snakes raft very readily on little rafts like that, rafted to one of those Puerto Rican islands, and then evolved and changed on the island, and then the species who was its ancestor is no longer similar enough to it on the mainland that anybody thinks they're related at all. Now, genetically, you may discover that, in fact, it's very related to some snake on the mainland who just doesn't look like it. Okay? So that's sort of the classical way of viewing this snake. We go out as biologists in the 1500s, land on Puerto Rico, we discover the snake, we discover it's only on this little set of islands, and we call it an endemic species. These become, of course, one of the sort of flagship species for conservation people. Because you can say that, well, there's only one of these in the world, it's only on these islands, so let's go to a special effort to keep this thing from being extinguished by whatever. And but of course, the other side of the question is, as tendency and biologists do, is to, wait a minute, there have been indigenous canoes circulating between these islands and the mainland of Central America for probably thousands of years. It's very easy for a snake like this to basically treat a canoe as a raft. So it's hiding in the canoe when it's beached on a beach somewhere on the mainland, and canoe goes to work, and it ends up on one of these Puerto Rican islands, and the snake hops off on it, and pretty soon we have a snake which is on the island. So now the snake is, in fact, might well not have evolved at all on the island, but the one on the mainland gone extinct or changed evolutionarily. So you don't even realize there was an ancestor there. But it didn't get there by sort of, shall we say, the haphazard luck or the haphazard biology of floating on a naturally occurring raft, but rather people took it there. And we find a number of species on these islands who clearly have that kind of origin of small rodents, reptiles, frogs, and lizards and snakes and frogs. And probably there's insects that way too, who are on the islands and thought of as endemic, but in fact, they either are very scarce on the mainland or they've actually disappeared on the mainland, but did not evolve on the island. But then of course, there's a set who do evolve on the island because now it's a little tiny population. And when it's a little tiny population, it's very easy for the circumstances, the temperature, the heat, the rainfall pattern, the food availability, all these things to create a very specific selective pressure for a behavior and a morphology that matches those things. Whereas if you're on the mainland and you're spread out over many different kinds of habitats with a very big population, it's much harder for there to be a selective trait that influences all the individuals. Okay. It happens, but it's harder. Now, it's not only animals, of course, that are moved by the water. These are seeds picked up off the beach, and to give you some sense of scale, this is a coconut here with its husk on the outside. Okay, so this would be a coconut from the center of one of these things to give you some sense of scale. So it's about a foot long, something like that. With its, so this is a thing which is, we're going to see a little more of this guy in a minute. And it's basically, you say, well, it's sort of drifted by the sea, they float in the water. Well, yes, but that's also it's not the haphazard dispersal of an insect on a raft coming down a river. This is the normal dispersal pattern of a coconut palm, is the ocean. That is its dispersal agent, okay? This big seed over here, which is the biggest legume seed in the world, called Mora, M-O-R-A, think of that as an enormous peanut. You can see that it was starting to germinate on the beach. And here are the young roots coming out down here. So this is not killed by the ocean. The coconut is not killed either. So the salt water, it can tolerate that. This guy is salt tolerant. This is a dead coconut from inside. And now we look at these seeds here and we ask, where do they come from? Well, some of these are from upriver, just like the vegetation or the insects from the raft. This thing right here, for example, is a big hard legume seed that is the size of a silver dollar or bigger, which I suppose most of you have never seen a silver dollar. But anyway, so this guy 1.5 inches across, something like that. Very hard, and something that when you go on a tourist trip in the tropics, in the New World tropics, you may well see one of these things strung on a necklace of seeds, which are sold as ornaments for tourists. That is the seed from a very big bean pod that was on a vine hanging over the river. The normal behavior of this thing is that it falls on the ground inside, not over the river, and an animal takes the seed away and buries it to eat later on. So that's, if you like, a normal, but some of those vines are over the river. So they fall in the water. This thing gets transported by the water all the way to an island way out somewhere, most of which dies, of course, but a few of these can end up on an island thousands of miles away. So they can hit that target by being very tolerant of salt water, but not germinating in it. You know, this guy is going to germinate in it. And so there's another one of these. This hard seed that you see here, and these hard seeds here, they're survivors. These seeds, when they fell from their tree into that water, basically drowned and died. But they're being carried out by the water into the ocean, and they simply end up being decomposed in the bottom of the ocean somewhere, eaten by some organism in the ocean. So this set of seeds off the beach is a mix of things which depend on that seawater to get them to where they're going to go, and we'll do an example here in a minute, to things that die when they get into that salt water or even in the fresh water. And then some things can go for a long time. And there are these seeds off the beaches in Iceland, in Norway, in South Africa, coming from Central America. All right, so here's a piece of original forest in Costa Rica. Here's the beach here, obviously, this is the ocean. And right here on the beach, you see these big palm tops. Those are coconut palms growing in their natural habitat, not planted by people. This is where coconut palms really grow. But their real ecosystem is the margin, not in the forest, not out on the beach, but right at that edge. And right here is a coconut floating. So you look at the coconut floating, you're out in your canoe, right? And you look at this coconut floating and you look at the palms right here. And so your reaction is, this is a coconut from those palms. Quite possibly very wrong. This coconut could be from Australia. In other words, the world is a sheet of coconuts, a very thin sheet of coconuts released by these trees on the edge, and they go everywhere. And every one of these trees here could be from a different place in the world. So you think of this, well, look, there's a population right there. They should all be genetically related to each other. They're all the same species. They all live in the same place. Could be totally wrong. This could be made up of one individual from the Solomon Islands, another individual from some other place, and we could just go on and on and on until we have a huge list of countries of the world in this one little piece of 100 meters or so of Costa Rican coastline. So now here's one of those coconuts right there, carried up there by high tide. You see this trash just running along like this? That could well be a mild storm or just ordinary high tide when the water gets all the way up to here. And this coconut was carried up to there. This is a virgin beach where nobody's been playing with them. There's no tourists here. We're on, like I say, we're on a little island off of Costa Rica, off of Puerto Rico. And you think, well, there we go. That's a successful dispersal of a coconut seed to this island. So it's part of the island flora now. There it is close up. And it's in fact germinating. See, here's the new young coconut tree sprout coming out of here. And you look at this and you're complacent. You think, wow, there it goes. That's a successful dispersal. That is very wrong. This guy who made it to this point is effectively dead. It's going to end up looking like that because it's at the high tide mark, basically where the storm tide takes it. And it's going to be buffered and rolled by every one of those high tides that takes place over the next 6 months. And what they're going to do is gradually grind that outer husk down, exposing the inside. Crabs get in through the portholes here for germination, and it dries out, and then basically the seedling dies, and that's it. So this looked like successful dispersal, and now there would be a population of coconut palms, perhaps, on this island. That's completely wrong. What makes it is one like this. This is one who was buried by a violent tide. And you see it's down under the ground here, maybe 6 inches, some bigger, or perhaps even deeper. That one is one who made it to the island. And that's one which will grow up to become an adult, like this. Now notice where it is. You see, here's high tide there. This is storm tide. The junk pushed up, the drift pushed up by a very violent storm. And here's the successful one just inside of that. And there's another one right here. So we'll assume that that one was a very violent storm that took it in very far. So ironically, what seems like really horrible weather is the thing that actually gets that kid to the right place. So it gets in here, it gets buried, and now we have a real honest to God adult with coconuts here. They're going to drop to here, And now we have a second problem because you need a storm to pick those guys up and take them out and throw them into the water so they can get to Australia or New Guinea or to Angola, or, you know, I mean, they go everywhere. So there's a lot of little fragile points in the lifespan of this beach edge tree. Now, if you look at this and you're saying here and you're a colonist or you're a farmer or whatever it is, and you would like to grow coconuts to sell on the market, whatever it is, you think, well, here they are out on the edge of the beach, so I'll pick up these coconuts and I'll take them inland and I'll grow them. I'll plant them and I'll bury them and they'll do just right and so on and so forth. They do so. They grow up. They become nice trees and you never get any coconuts. And why you never get any coconuts? Because when you put them inside the forest, when you put them away from this beach edge, you put them into the world of rodents, squirrels, agoutis, various chewing rodents, all of whom just love things like coconuts to be predators on. So the irony is that this is a safe space, what we call a safe site for this species. In other words, it's got a few very big, very susceptible kids. And if they don't get out of there into the ocean, they're dead. But there's very few of those mammals right out here on the edge of the beach for several reasons. One is there's not much food there. The other is they don't like being in the open, but they're exposed to predators. So if you're in Puerto Rico and you're from Europe and you look at these coconut palms and you decide, oh, but we really want to have coconut meat, we want to have coconut oil, we want to have a lot of coconuts, so how do we do it? You grow a plantation on an island that doesn't have any vertebrates. Or you do this. You see the bands on the trees right here, the metal bands? Those are to keep rats, Puerto Rican rats, from Southeast Asia who've been introduced to Puerto Rico because there wasn't any rat there beforehand. So you could plant these palms. There wouldn't be no climbing animal who would go up there and get the young seeds out here, nor get them on the ground. Now you build your plantation, and if you want to have any yield from these things, you got to put bands on here that stop, they're too slippery for the rodent to be able to climb up. So that's what you're seeing in this photograph, these bands on the trees. Now, you're the grower, you did this. The rats got there by being stowaways on ships going to Puerto Rico. You put the bands on, they work pretty well. They don't work 100% well. And you think, well, who likes to eat rats? Oh, mongooses do. India, South Asia, Africa is full of mongooses. And they're death on rodents, snakes, lizards, any small vertebrate on the ground. So what do? You introduce mongooses to Puerto Rico, where they are today. And the mongooses proceed to eliminate everybody who lives on the island except for that one species of snake and one frog that gets up in the trees. So what happens is you put an introduced species in there to help you with your coconut palms, and it clobbered the native fauna on the island. And the consequence of that is right now is it's against all federal laws in the United States to own a mongoose either as a pet or as a zoo animal. And there were a few in the 20s and 30s and 40s that were in zoos. They were all killed. The only ones that survived were males. They allowed males to live out their life in zoos. I saw one when I was a kid in Minnesota. And from then on, no more zoos, no more mongooses were allowed to be introduced into North America on the continent. Well, somebody, for the same purposes that we see here on Puerto Rico, then introduced it into Venezuela. And the great mystery is, why is the mongoose staying in Venezuela? Why is it not already migrated overland all the way up into the United States? And I can't answer that question for you at all. I have never seen them in Venezuela. I don't understand their biology there, but it's a classical Indian mongoose, the same one that's in Puerto Rico. Now, moving on, I just realized last night as I was looking at this slide that this picture wouldn't mean anything to most of you. You're too young. But this is the site of the United States' first atom bomb test on Inuit Atoll. And so therefore it's obviously thoroughly unoccupied island. And this is a remnant of one of the various boats that were put out there to see what's the impact of an atomic bomb on boats on the ocean when the explosion took place. And on this beach, you see this vine which is spreading out over the beach. These are long vine branches, saying these green leaves are. And the name for it is Canavalia. And here we are on this island way out in the middle of the Pacific. And then we go to the coast of Costa Rica and we have exactly the same species. This is like a coconut, except that it's not the big husk coconut. It's a little hard bean seed, which is extremely hard and very, very, very resistant to salt water. So the surface of the earth is also a thin sheet of these Canavalia seeds. So here we're looking at the Canavalia, the purple flowers that you just barely make out over here, which look like that, could be from anywhere. In other words, these seeds, again, just like coconuts, could be from any part of the world. So what I'm really saying to you is that the stuff that is water dispersed among islands can have a very different genetic composition on islands than somebody who only gets there by a one-time immigration by one seed and just barely makes it on an island. So the island is made up entirely of the genotype of that one seed. Because this you could have 55, you could have 100 genotypes on this little piece of beach of the Canavalia seeds. Now, there's much more to this than just what I just said. As you can see, here's a pod, and the pea looks like a sort of brownish colored large black bean as you would buy in the grocery store. And there's a record from the 1800s of a shipwreck that occurred off the coast of South America somewhere. I think perhaps Venezuela, I'm not certain, but off the coast of an English ship that shipwrecked, and some 18 English sailors made it to the beach. And the ship went down, but they made it to the beach. And obviously we were very happy with having made it to the beach, and looked around them, and what they saw were these beans. So they very happily, being northern bean plant oriented, agriculture oriented people, harvested a lot of the beans from these pods, put them in a pot, made soup out of them. They all filled themselves up with the bean soup. And the next morning there was only one alive. And the one alive actually transcribed all the details of what actually happened. And what actually happened is a very interesting chemical story about chemical defenses of seeds. Now, what happened to me was, not knowing this story, I was collecting these bean seeds, which are this, and they're about 1 inch across, something like that, in Costa Rica. And they are closely related to the Canavalia seed that we had back here, which in the Canavalia seed is full of a compound called cannabinine. Now, what is cannabinine? This is arginine right here. This is the chemistry of, this is one of the amino acids that makes up the proteins in your body. So if we just stand you up and dissolve everything except the arginine, you're still standing there. It's part of everything in you. All the protein molecules that make you up have got cannabinine in them somewhere. Well, right up here is you got arginine in you somewhere. Up here is cannabinine, and notice the difference between this molecule and that molecule. There's an oxygen right there, whereas there's no oxygen right there. That's the only difference. So these are two very similar molecules. This one is called an amino acid, arginine. This one is called an uncommon amino acid. It's a small molecule, just like this is a small molecule. But this is one of those things that 100 years ago would have been called garbage, trash, accidental, mistakes. What we know now is this is the defense compound of these seeds. Now, so here we have this seed. A chemist has told me and taught me about the cannabinine, 5% by dry weight in this seed. which is the same cannabinine that's in the seed of these guys. Okay? So that's what they made soup for themselves out of that cannabinine. Now here's the insects I was working on, which are these. This seed is sliced open, and inside are these larvae. So it's obvious that the insect has been eating the seed rich in this secondary compound. So we have some insect who's very resistant to that cannabinine. You aren't, it is. So here's the beetle itself. These are the developing ones. It's finally full size. It cuts a hole almost through the seed coat, which you see right here. And then it pupates inside. And when the adult's ready, which you can see right here, he reaches up and he pops the top out of this hole, and here's the adult who just walked out. So that's the actual animal who's able to eat 5% dry weight cannabinine in its food. How does it do that? It's got a smart enzyme that can tell the difference between this one and that one. So when it gets inside, it takes the smart enzyme and picks this one out selectively, chops it into 2 pieces, and uses the pieces to build its own amino acids. So that's how it detoxifies the secondary compound, which is the defensive compound for this seed against mice, rodents, and any kind of animal who would chew them up and eat them. And that's the actual animal who's capable of doing it. This then became very exciting to the molecular physiology kinds of people. And so we know these stories because they did that. We found the beetle and the seeds. They did the time and work to figure out this story that I'm telling you over here. So, and this incidentally, just for your own understanding of how publications go, this photograph right here, this plate right here, is what was called a figure introduction to their paper. You look on scientific papers, almost invariably have a text introduction. This one has this photograph as its introduction. So if you're a big pharma person, you're somebody who works with chemicals, defensive chemicals and seeds and things like that, you look at this and you build a story yourself by seeing these different examples put out there in front of you as the abstract for the paper. Now, it's not just beans or coconuts that go all around the world this way. This is a grass. And you can see how the grass has organized itself. You know, grass comes in stems that produce clusters of leaves. And this is set up so that this right here is fragile. So when a big storm hits this, it breaks this and this and this and this, and these little pieces go floating off everywhere. So they become like the seeds. These are very ordinary grass seeds, just like rice seeds. But the way it did, and they would never survive in salt water. The way the plant disperses here now is by being broken into many, many pieces, and each piece of the plant is what floats all over the surface. So this grass is from every beach, tropical beach in the world has got this grass on it. And I meet it everywhere I go, or everywhere I've gone. Now, another aspect of islands, which has been known and understood by, and you're going to remember, of course, that people knew about islands very intensively, especially when transport was mostly by water, because islands were, of course, these nice places in the water where you could rest, you could get out, you could get water, you could get food, you could bury your treasure. I don't care what you're going to do, but the point is they were a very useful piece of the environment, even if they were very small. Well, in the Indian Ocean, there's a thing called the Mauritius Islands, which are, I don't know, 500 miles from the coast of Madagascar, 800 miles, I can't remember exactly, but the point is they're way out in the middle of nowhere. And a pigeon, literally a pigeon, the things that look, you know, the things that walk up and down the street here, got to one of those islands a long time ago. I've never seen a dating exercise for this, so I don't know how many millions of years we're talking about, but we're talking about a lot of time. But it started with a pigeon that looked just like the pigeons that you know on the street. So this animal, the dodo, evolved on the island. Now, we don't have a photograph of a dodo to show you. There are no photographs of dodos. But there is a preserved head of one in the British Museum, brought back by some sailor in the British Navy. So we have a little bit of an idea. And of course, there's carcasses, there's fossil remains of these guys. So we have all the written drawings and paintings and remembrances of the sailors who met them on the Mauritius Islands. But they really basically became a flightless pigeon the size of a turkey. Now, because they evolved on an island which had no predators, no ground-based predators, no rats, no mammals, nothing, no snakes, no lizards, they had only themselves as competitors. They only had themselves, only had the weather as a problem. So the size comes in great part from bulking up huge amounts of fat and muscle. And the muscle was to compete with other birds, yourself, other birds in the same species. And the muscle, the fat, was basically to get you through the times of year when there wasn't any fruit available, or seeds, whichever ones they were getting their food from. The diet was probably very similar to current pigeons, fruits and seeds. And so what do you need wings for? You can't, the island's a little island. You can't, there's no place to fly. And in fact, furthermore, if you get up in the air, you get blown out in the ocean. So very quickly, there seems to have been selection for basically flightlessness. So you end up with birds with basically rudimentary wings down to nothing, very, very big body size, which means it would have been much harder to fly if they had been trying to fly or if they had been evolving towards flight. And storage of large quantities of food for making it through the wrong time of year, and powerful to be able to beat up the other ones who were, of course, trying to eat the same fruits and seeds that you were, because you were down on the ground. You weren't flying around picking them out of the tops of trees. You were down there getting them on the ground, just like mammals competing with each other. Well, all these things take place in a place where you don't have to be thinking about predators. So what happens when the naval ships arrive on this island? These birds are just Christmas at the supermarket, and they just literally walked across the land, beating them over the head and having a great time eating the meat, and extinguished the dodo. And the dumb as a dodo means that these animals simply didn't have a flight, a fear response of running away from this predator. And that kind of, if you like, innocence on islands is very common. There still is today. The Galapagos lizards on the Galapagos Islands off of South America have much of the same behavior. Many animals on islands lose their, shall we say, their skittishness towards potential predators, simply because they live in a world that doesn't have any. Now, this is me walking across a street in Greece, and right in the middle of the intersection is this tortoise. It's about the size of a grapefruit, and it's a classical European tortoise. And so, you know, it's just another tortoise, fine, another ground-dwelling turtle. But this is the kind of animal, and probably the same size, that was the ancestor of the big Galapagos tortoises, which are, that animal probably weighs 300, 400 pounds, something like that, and it's huge. And so how do you get an enormous tortoise like that to an island off the coast of South America? Well, there's two ways. One is when he's little like this, in fact, this one or a juvenile of him could easily raft a serious distance. Now, whether it would raft whatever the 300 miles or however it is, 400 miles out to the Galapagos Islands is perhaps a questionable thing. But the thing that people tend to forget is there was a time when sea level was at least 300 feet, if not much more so, lower than it is now. So when you have sea level very low, an island like the Galapagos Island becomes much closer to the mainland, because as the sea level goes down, the mainland basically expands because the shallow water on the margin of the mainland is now exposed. So you can walk out. So probably the islands were much closer. The Galapagos Islands were probably much closer to the South American mainland at the time when these little guys got to the island to evolve into these enormous things. So here with this animal, you're basically seeing a turtle version of the dodo. This animal is completely nonplussed, doesn't bothered by people at all. There weren't any predators in his world when they're this size. When they're very small, yes, there still are some predators, but the big size like this is basically safe. But what it's got is seasonal problems, times a year when food is not available. And it's got competition between it and others for things like these cactus pads that you see. Now, these cactus pads have been put on the ground by people, so they were easy for the tortoise to get. But in nature, here he is stretching upwards. The tip of his nose up here would be about the height of my belt on my leg. I have never been close to one of these animals. I've only seen them close to other people. But I know that would be about 3.5 feet off the ground, something like that. So that's how they can reach. This is a browse line on cactus on the Galapagos. In other words, there's competition for getting that one little cactus pad that's low enough down so they can reach it. And that's what, so of course, the selection is for this very long neck as well, is to be able to reach that food. But this guy evolved there on the Galapagos from an animal who looked like that. And like I say, either he got there by rafting or got there by rafting when it was much closer. I don't think the Galapagos ever, no, I think it's firmly established that the Galapagos has never been actually connected to the mainland of South America. And we, of course, have small tortoises like this in South America, just like you do in the southwestern US. This is a juvenile of that tortoise. And that egg is about the size of a navel orange, maybe bigger than a tennis ball. And here from the finger that's in the photograph here, you get an idea how big this kid is. Mom makes a very small number of very large kids. So these relatively large kids then, out from a few large eggs, produce large individuals who are basically very good at, well, they've got enough food reserves to make it through the first dry season, if not the second dry season, the harsh time of the year from the standpoint, because obviously this guy cannot reach up and get a hold of a cactus pad 3.5 feet off the ground. So the juveniles have got the hard time of life. And you started out by making a small number of big ones, which is quite different from if you had predators, active predator community, you make a large number of small ones. Okay. Now, changing gear a little bit to something else that goes on an island that is very different from the mainland. We talked about tubers before this. So I'm driving down a road in Guatemala, and I look up where the bulldozer went by, and I see this thing on the roadside. That's a 6-inch ruler right there. Sorry, 15 centimeter, 6-inch ruler right there next to it. And you see the stem that comes out of it and goes up here like that, and then dies. That probably was the stem to the ground surface when the bulldozer sliced through this in cleaning up and building the road. So now that's happened. Well, the tuber got left. And out of that stem, this other stem coming out of the tuber comes a new sprout, which is growing back up here to the surface again. So now in the real world, if you were out there without bulldozers, what you would see is this sprout sticking out of the dirt. And here is the tuber. What is that? That's about 6 or 8 of these links underground, where it's well protected from digging mammals. Okay. So as we've talked about before, and what this is going to do now is produce a big vine, and you think of this vine as being a sweet potato vine, and if you dig under a sweet potato vine, you get sweet potatoes, except that for me, I didn't know anything about this kind of thing at the time. What I saw was this tuber, and so I hopped out of the car, collected the tuber, and wanted to dry it down as a herbarium specimen. for somebody to tell me more about it later on. So I get back to the house and I put it in the oven to dry it. I go out, do something, I don't know. I come back in the house a half an hour later and the entire house reeks of baking sweet potatoes. And that's when I realized what I had put in the oven. Now this thing this tuber was hard as a rock, but it became soft in the oven, just like sweet potatoes from the grocery store do. So you can see it's not a big jump for indigenous people to learn to recognize, to take this tuber and throw it in the fire and cook it and eat it, and then away you go. So we're not talking about something like this. It does not require a big jump in order to turn into behavior that looks just like your kitchen here in Philadelphia. Well, that's on the mainland. So now we're here on an island off the coast of Puerto Rico where there aren't any animals that can do the digging. And we're working with students measuring the plants on the island. And suddenly I look up and I realize, whoa, you see this right here? You see that right there? Those are tubers above ground. So the vine is doing the same thing that it does on the mainland, except that it now is, selection has allowed it to string the tubers anywhere. They don't have to be underground. So now we get tubers above ground on the island. Just a simple little difference like that. You look at a photograph and you see tubers up on a stem like this, and you realize, whoa, that was taken on an island somewhere. And when you see the tubers coming out of the ground, you say, whoa, those are on the mainland somewhere. So these are the kinds of things that begin, the little things that when you add them up, big individuals, small number of kids, big number of kids, I mean, big sized kids, but a small number of them, tubers above ground, and many other traits. And we're going to drill down into a number of these traits now. Now, this was a process with a class, which is what this is. It's like you all. Measuring or trying to quantify the difference between insect communities as a whole on an island and insect communities as a whole on the mainland. Costa Rica on the one hand, Puerto Rico on the other hand, and Providencia Island and the Caribbean as well. And the methodology I have to first describe to you, and then we'll get to the results from the methodology. You see these nets right here look like butterfly nets on his hand, the handle, but instead of being flimsy, delicate tissue inside as in a butterfly net, what you're seeing here is heavy white muslin that can take a lot of beating. That's a sweep net. So what you're doing is you're walking through the vegetation, sweeping the vegetation with this very tough butterfly net, except it's for beetles and bugs and things like that, sweeping through it, and you count how many you do. So you walk in a straight line, you do 100 sweeps, you dump the contents of the net into a bag, you kill everything in the bag, and now you have a sample of what you got from 100 sweeps of vegetation. So here they are walking through. Here's the guy counting the paces. Here's somebody to carry the bags of insects, and here's the person in front doing the sweeping, all right? So they're walking through the vegetation, sweeping with a sweep net in the rainy season in this particular case. Then you go back to the same spot in the dry season. So this is the dry season, exact same place. This is the rainy season. And sorry, this is the dry season, and the previous one is the rainy season, and you do the same thing over again. And then you compare the two. And so now we can ask, how does the insect community in the dry season differ from the insect community in the rainy season? So that was the first exercise that this class got engaged in by using that kind of technology, if you like. It's very primitive, but it's it gives you numerical results, and it gives you nice clean results right away. Now today we would not do morphological identification of the insects like we did back then. This is in the 60s. And so we had to use morphological identification. And today the ideal thing would be to use genetic identification, which would help you locate a lot more species that otherwise you wouldn't notice. So this is the result. So this is the junk that comes out of that net, for example. You do it on the tabletop and say, here's a a fly here, and there's a bug on its back over here, and there's a bug here. There's one there, and you pick them up with a pair of forceps and pull them into a plate, and pretty soon you've got a petri dish full of insects from a sweep sample. Okay, so there's our bulk. And like I say, today we would look at this guy right here who looks just like that one right there, and like that one right there, and that one right there, but have done a genetic analysis of these, and we discovered this was in fact 3 species, not 1. So in other words, in those days, we didn't get absolute numbers as accurately as we would today, but the point was you can get a big difference. So now let's look at what happens. This is hundreds of sweeps on this axis over here. And in this particular case, it's how many beetle species do you accumulate over hundreds of sweeps. Okay. So, and this is different times of year. So here's the December dry season coming on here. And then this is May when the rain's just starting over here, and this is July after they've been, this is May over here, this is July over here. As you can see, these are different months of the year. Anyway, that was the goal of this particular graph. But what I want to do is get the methodology straight here in your head. So you do 100 sweeps here, and you add up how many beetle species did you get, and you get this many, which is, let's say, 18. Then you get another 100 sweeps, and you get, now we're up to 20. And then pretty soon you're up to 25, and eventually you level off to what's called an asymptote. So it gets, you can take many more samples, you get the same number. The number just goes on and on and on because you've got all the species that are in the sampleable place that you're doing the recording from. So what you can see is that right after the rains have started, you get very large numbers of species of beetles in the same place. Whereas at the end of the year, at the lower end of the dry season coming on, you get the lowest number. And then in July, after the rains have been there for a while, you eventually catch up with the same, you end up with the same kind of record. So that's a way of comparing the seasons, or in this case, beetles, or bugs. Right? Now, we can also do this over elevation. So this is going up the side of a mountain. And this is the number, for example, there's the number of beetles that you get down at 200 meters elevation. And there's only what it looks like about 85, something like that. Surprisingly, as you go up the mountain, the number of beetle species does not go down, it goes up, as you can see here. And other things go up, other things go up, other things go up, and flies go particularly up. This is called a mid-elevation hump, meaning that there's something peculiar about intermediate elevations where you have more species than you expected. It's getting colder. It's getting, more, what you think of as more miserable conditions as you go up the mountain. But in fact, what's happening is, down here at sea level in the tropics, at the bottom, the daytime is very nice, warm and all these kinds of things, sunlight, everything. And the night is very warm. That's a problem for plants because plants can't turn off at night. So they burn up what they made in the daytime. The outcome being that they don't have as much resource to be harvested by all these insects. At middle elevations, we have sunlight, quite enough sunlight. It's warm enough for photosynthesis, but at night it's cold. So you don't burn it up. So you have more, you make more fruits, you make more seeds, you make more leaves, you make more new twigs, you make more roots, you do all the things you do, you make more of them, which means more of them can get eaten. And if you can get more of them eaten, then you get more species stacked onto that. So that's where the middle elevation hump comes from. Then when you get high elevation, it's cold in the daytime, cold at night, and you can't do as much photosynthesis. So everybody drops down. Okay. So that's another way of using sweep samples. So now we can ask, how does an island compare with a mainland in this kind of way of doing things? This is Puerto Rico. This is the class. Here you can see the sweep nets in their hands. There's a sweep net over here. And as we go across this field, I suddenly look at it and I realize, whoa, these are all the same species of plants that we know in Costa Rica. So when you're comparing the mainland with the island for this trashy second growth, which is what this is, these are all regenerating pastures and all regenerating fields in both cases. This is a common weed flora, if you like. It's the thing that's in Guatemala, it's in Venezuela, it's in Mexico, it's in Costa Rica, it's in Brazil, it's in Venezuela. It's basically the same set of plants who live in the trashy places that humans live behind. And so I realized suddenly that we have one variable removed, because it's not that these are different insects on different kinds of plants. These are the different insects on the same kinds of plants. Okay. So this is Puerto Rico. This is a little island called Providencia, which is in the same Caribbean area. Same thing again. Here's a Crescenia tree. It's right in front of my house in Costa Rica. These are all the things that are the same. Like I say, they're the same things as the mainland. And these guys are just sweeping more vegetation of the same species and so on. So here we go. This pasture right here is an easy one to use for comparison, called Timoga pasture. And it's in the rainy season, so it's wet, right? So this is the level, for example, of beetles that we get after 16, this is a lot of sweeps, okay? So we get up here and we got 75 species of beetles there, rainy season. And it's flattened off to an asymptote. Now the same pasture in the dry season is this dark line down here. And it's doing the same thing. It rises slowly and finally trickles off to an asymptote. So at the end of the day, we're saying is that 2,400 sweeps in this old pasture on the mainland, the dry season is generating about 18 species, 20, 18 species of beetles. In the rainy season, the same pasture is creating about 75 or some number like that. So the big difference between the rainy season and the dry season. Now, here's the island, Providencia. Providencia is the same as the dry season all year round. In other words, when the dry season hits Providencia, the beetle density does not go down. When the rainy season hits Providencia, the beetle density doesn't go up. What we're really saying is the only people who can survive on the islands are the ones who can handle anything. They can handle the worst kind of weather or the best kind of weather, and they do the same. Part of the secret to that is that here on the mainland, in the dry season, where are these species of beetles? They migrate out of the pasture to local wet spots along a river. And then when they go to the local wet spot, and then when the rains come, they migrate back into the open pasture where there's nice sunlight and it's wet. So there, they just do fine. But they have a river to go to. There aren't any rivers in Puerto Rico for them to go to. There are no rivers in Providencia. It's not big enough. It doesn't have a mountain range. It doesn't have the circumstances that generate these big wet spots to go through the dry season. So if you can make it anywhere, then you make it on the island. So now suddenly we've identified another trait of islands, is that when you get rafted to one or you get blown to one by a hurricane and you think, man, I made it to the beach. Now you have to be able to handle the circumstances of the island. And that's a characteristic that goes with any kind of island, whether it's a pond or an island in the ocean or whatever kind it is. You've got to not only get there, you got to get to the target, but you have to be able to handle the peculiar circumstances, the peculiar differences between what's on the mainland and what's on the island. The irony in this one is biologists studiously avoid this kind of trait. And it comes about by accident. The people who do biology on islands almost always do all their biology on islands. And the people who do their biology on mainlands almost always do all their biology on mainlands. And I just by accident happened to have the peculiar trait that I was jumping back and forth between Caribbean islands and the Central American mainland. Now, there's another aspect of islands. You start out with a new island, day zero. It's a volcano that arises through the ocean, or it's a peninsula who got the tip cut off by rise in sea level and it made an island. The classical mindset is that species will accumulate on that island over time, and eventually will reach an asymptote. That's things that are arriving. Okay, it takes time for things to arrive. You know? So they have, and eventually you get them all there. You can't get it anymore. However, if you go out there and you keep track of this island, this asymptote, year after year after year after year, it turns out it stays the same, but the species change. So you have new species all the time on the island, which means that each time somebody new gets there, somebody new drops out. Somebody old drops out. In other words, it's a bucket that you can only fill so full. So that's and that's an ecological time. So you're a lizard, you get to the island, fine. I now count one species of lizard living on the island. But some other species of lizard arrives on the island who's bigger and badder or worse or whatever the hell it is than you are. So it eliminates you. And now there's still one species of lizard on the island, but it's a different species. Now we'll repeat that for all kinds of different lifestyles. That's one way this can happen. The other is evolutionary time. In other words, if this is long periods of time, well, some of these species evolve and split into other species. And so you get more and more species accumulating by making different kinds of species on the island itself. Well, it turns out the same overfull bucket analogy occurs. If you have one lizard on the island and it splits into two for whatever reason, can the island handle two? Is there ecological space on the island for two? If there is, then you end up with a two-species island. But if there isn't, you still only have one, but you've evolved a new one, and through evolution and competition, you bump the other one off. Okay. Now, I'll show you a concrete example of this ownership of the island. Here's another little island. There's our boats right there. We're just off the coast of Puerto Rico. We take the class in there, and what they're doing here is monitoring the ants that own this island. So you see there's three people in a line here. They put a thread down across the dirt all the way back to here. And every half meter on the thread, they put down a little piece of tuna fish. So now what they're doing is recording how long does it take by which species of ant to find the little piece of tuna fish. So to jump ahead of the outcome here, the outcome of this on this island is that it takes about 10 to 20 seconds for that to be found by the ants. And what they find is that it's the same species of ants everywhere. Out here on the edge, in here, and way back in the shade. I.e., one species of ant owns the whole island. We go back to the same island the next year and do exactly the same experiment. And it takes exactly the same, like 10 or 15 seconds, whatever, some very small length of time, to find the piece of tuna fish. But it's a different species of ant. In the meantime, our ant colony died, or was clobbered by a hurricane, or disease got it, or anything that happened to it. Whatever had happened to it, it's gone. There's not a trace of it. And another one has taken over this resource. And as we watch this over a 10-year period, I think there were at least 4 times of change of ownership. So now we go on the mainland and we do the same experiment. It takes 10 to 15 to 20 minutes for the piece of tuna fish to be found. And almost every piece of tuna fish is found by a different species of ant. So what we're saying here is that the scavenger community and the ownership of this system on the island is very different on the mainland. But if you pool across all the islands in the Caribbean, you get a species list of ants almost as long as you do it on the mainland. But they're partitioned a totally different way among the resource called an island in the ocean. I only have about 4 minutes here left. This is a spider community. That's all one species of spider on a different small island. And There it is again. And here it is again in its web. And there it is again with a damselfly as food. So we really looked at this very hard. Island was owned by, this is a different one now, owned by one species of spider. 2 years later, we go back to the same island and it's owned by this spider. And the first one is totally gone, not a trace. And this guy is everywhere. Same phenomenon, high turnover rate. This is an anolis lizard for which the Caribbean islands are famous for all kinds of studies. One island can have this species of anolis lizard on it, and the next year it can have a totally other species of anolis lizard on it. And you don't evolve a new species of anolis or spider or ant in 1 year. So this is ecological replacement. Somebody gets there, spreads out over the resource, and then gets clobbered by something or a better competitor. Now, I only want 1 minute here. I'm going to finish this off. Now we're on Puerto Rico itself, a bigger island, much bigger island. I take the students out to this forest. We walk into the forest, and I say to them, okay, the exercise you're going to do is mark off about 40 or 50 square meters and collect every seedling in it. Pull it up by its roots. We go back to the lab, and I want you to spread them out on the lab tables and put each species in its own pile. So I go away. I come back 2 or 3 hours later, and I walk into the lab, and there's one enormous pile on one table. And I thought, oh God, I didn't explain what I wanted them to do. So I tear into them about not having spread them out. No, sir. No, sir. No, sir. It's all the same species. So I got to thinking, we go back to this forest and we take a look at it. And I look down at the seedlings. It's all the same species. There's not a single other species, and they're all trophus. Look how many seedlings there are. This is a common tree where we live in Costa Rica. It makes a very high quality nut, like a filbert. The rodents love that nut. The trees make seeds. The rodents eat all of them. On the island, there are no rodents of the kinds that eat these things. There's rats in the palm plantations, but the point is out here in the forest, none. So what you make is a huge number of seeds. They all germinate, and they all die. So you're feeding the decomposition community a totally different way. Instead of running your kids through a rodent population, who turns into makes rodents out of it, make turds out of it, makes urine out of it, and you get a very different process going on with the same species of tree. So what happens is it turns out that the species of tree who does best on this particular soil and moisture level and climate situation ends up owning it competitively. That's it. And some other slope, another kind of soil, will have a different species of tree on it, and it will own it competitively, totally. So you got a totally different structure on an island than you do on the mainland. Okay, I have run out of time here, so I'm going to have to stop. There are a few more slides with a few words at the bottom of each one of them. I think it's probably good for you to take a look at the remaining slides or so on Canvas, please. Okay, we'll stop there.